Well, we are going to probe some of these audit findings in greater detail tonight in our program. More on taxpayers in a moment and on the treatment of victims of sexual misconduct in the military. But first, let's focus on the findings about the government's handling of fighter jets. Now, normally we would welcome Auditor General Michael Ferguson to our program, but he did not personally deliver the audits today for health reasons, but his very capable auditors did. One of them is Casey Thomas, and she was the principal auditor for the chapter on fighter jets. She's with me now. Good to see you.
Great.
Thanks for coming to talk about this with me. Let's start at the beginning, if I can, and why the Auditor General's office decided to audit Canada's fighter jet program.
We have an audit selection process, a strategic audit planning process, where we identify risks, we identify areas that we think are going to add value to both parliamentarians and to Canadians. And this was the next audit on our list to follow up on. So this is the work we've done for this tabling.
Okay. In 2016, the government directed DND to have enough aircraft on hand to meet Canada's NATO and NORAD needs every day. That's kind of in the background of your audit report today. And I guess I'm wondering, why would the government do that when it was being advised at the time that it didn't have the planes or the pilots to meet that policy? Now, that's kind of a political question, but what did you find in doing the audit about whether this should have been known to the government that you can't meet this policy?
The objective of the audit was to determine whether or not national defence was managing risks in order to meet NORAD and NATO until a replacement fleet was put in place. So that's what we looked at. Were they managing their risks? One of the things we bumped into was that in 2016, as you mentioned, the government changed the policy. And that policy change came at a time when national defence was already facing a shortage in technicians and pilots. And so in terms of why they made that decision, that's definitely, as you suggest, a policy decision that you'd have to ask the government. But National Defence's own analysis demonstrated that they had a shortage in their personnel, and that this change in policy was going to make that shortage even worse.
Right. How so?
With respect to the number of airplanes it was going to be able to prepare, so the technicians prepare and maintain the planes, and then the pilots, that they don't have enough pilots to fly them. So the change in policy actually resulted in the need for National Defence to increase its production of aircraft by 23%.
Okay, so the government opted to buy 25 used jets from Australia. Does that purchase make sense?
The decision to buy Australian jets is a government decision. National Defence's analysis demonstrated that what it needed was more personnel in terms of technicians and pilots. So by buying the Australian jets, they're not actually going to solve their fundamental problems, which are a problem with HR and personnel.
I don't know how much you looked into this, but can you answer the question as to why the Air Force is losing more pilots than it's training? Did you find that out?
We didn't look at the reasons why. We did make a recommendation that National Defence should implement a plan to recruit and retain. They did agree with this recommendation, and I would expect that as part of addressing our recommendation, they would determine why they're having problems recruiting and retaining and address these issues as part of their plan.
Okay. Your audit also identified that the aging planes we have, the CF-18s, they're becoming more obsolete because I guess the Air Force thought they'd have new fighter jets by now, so they haven't been doing the kind of upgrades that you would expect to be done to those. So what is being done to keep the CF-18s combat ready? What did you find?
We looked at two aspects, whether or not National Defence had anything in place to keep the planes flying, and whether or not they had anything to keep their combat capability updated. With respect to flying, they have extended the fleet out to 2032. With respect to combat capability, they haven't invested in combat capability since about 2008 in some respects, and in 2011 they did do some weapons upgrades in relation to their mission in Libya. But ultimately, once again, we made a recommendation with respect to combat capability, and they have agreed to look into what investments should be made.
So I guess the commitment is, or the government policy is, that we need to have enough aircraft and aircraft ready to meet both NATO and NORAD needs. Are we anywhere near that? And are you confident in the audit that you're seeing a plan for the government to get to that?
So at this point in time, National Defence is able to prepare about 83% of the planes that it needs in order to meet its commitments. The plan that it has in place, I would say that in agreeing with our recommendations, that's a good start, and they need to continue to address the issues of personnel and combat capability in order to be able to meet the commitments that we have in relation to NORAD and NATO.
Right, and but with the purchase of these 25 new Australian, I mean, how valuable are those 25 used Australian planes going to be to this program?
National Defence says that the purchase of the Australian fleets will help them better manage the fleet. Our audit, I would say what we looked at was the fact that unless they improve their ability to recruit and retain technicians and pilots, the purchase of Australian jets isn't going to help them in the same way as an increase in personnel would.
Again, did you find any? So now the government says it's going to develop a plan, and I think it's started down that road. But to be clear, there was no plan in place for the period of time that you did the audit. These more pilots were leaving than they were training, and they didn't have enough technicians, and there was no plan to fix that till now.
There was a plan in place with respect to technicians. They have implemented a plan to move some technicians from second line to first line maintenance, and this should help them. The plan was too early for us to be able to determine whether or not the plan was a success. With respect to pilots, they have a general plan to recruit pilots in general into the Air Force, but they didn't have a plan in place specifically related to fighter pilots to address the issues that are specific and unique to the fighter force. After the period under audit, they did put a plan in place to improve the expertise or the experience level of the pilots they currently have, but as far as we can tell, that plan wasn't going to address the need to increase the number of pilots. And once again, that plan being put in place late, we weren't able to audit whether or not the plan was a success.
All right, Casey Thomas, thanks for your time tonight. Appreciate it.
Great, thanks for having me.